was magnificent. Thank you. It was really much needed and wonderful. It was great.
Good. Well, you were missed, but Dwayne did a wonderful job on Sunday.
I know. I saw. He was amazing. He was amazing. And you guys had Bible study last week too, right?
Yes, we did.
I thought you did, and I thought Dwayne was leading it. So.
Did it make sense based on what we discussed last week, Wendy?
It did, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your family story as well.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it was really a kind of an amazing experience, and just I think the thing that was just utterly amazed is how quiet he had kept that whole thing. And like I said, my father hadn't heard that. And I mean, he was, my dad would have been 82, 83 when he'd heard that story. And it was the first time he'd ever heard. It was just, something he carried for so long in his, just, I can't imagine.
I can't either.
I know. All right. I was just getting us all set up online. We're just on Facebook. I'm sure we'll have some folks join us there in just a minute. We're going to be looking at Exodus again. We're going to be looking at a little bit later in Exodus, Exodus 7, verses 8 through 23, which is the beginning of the plagues. So if you woke up this morning and were like, you know what, I feel like I need to connect with some plagues because the coronavirus isn't quite doing it. This is your time. So this is all set. So welcome. Looks like we've got a couple more folks joining us, which is great. Lori, good to have you here. Dave's jumping in too, which is great. So, all right. Before we jump into today's scripture prayers, joys, and concerns, what do you all have anything you would like to share with the community?
Can I share?
Mm-hmm.
I told you about my niece, Bethany, who is pregnant and has breast cancer. She starts her chemo today.
Okay.
And her mother, who is my sister, is having half a lung removed tomorrow because she has lung cancer. So it's kind of hard on that family.
Okay.
Her name is Linda.
Linda. Well, prayers for Bethany, and I know we've been praying for her, and prayers for Linda as well. Good gracious. Are they here are they close by, or are they far?
Bethany lives in Chicago and Linda lives in Aurora.
Okay. Well, which is funny because in these times, that's close, but during coronavirus, that doesn't make as much of it. It's a little bit harder. So, prayers for you. I know that's hard. I know you'd want to be there with them. So,
I do get to be with my sister.
Oh, good.
They let her have one person, so I'll be able to.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good to hear. Good. Great. Other prayers? Yeah, Wendy.
I'll just update with some praise. Mike's sister, Christina, and her husband, Ryan, and kids are recovering well from COVID in Florida, and things seem to be going fine. Mike's mom will find relief in back surgery in 2 weeks.
Okay.
And as far as I know, Mike's cousin, Michelle, is continuing to heal. So all is looking up.
Wow.
Amen. It's been quite a couple weeks for that family. So happy to hear things are moving up, looking up. Other prayers. Okay, I had just had a couple that just wanted to share with the congregation or with you guys, just to keep in your prayers. We had a bunch of folks who had surgery this last week and have been in and out of the hospital. So Ken Bredemeyer and Ole Simberg were both in and out of the hospital. So prayers for them as they recover from home. Twig had rotator cuff surgery. She's home, but that's kind of a long recovery. If you have had it or know someone who's had it, it's a bit rough there. Carrie O'Leary, was great to see her last night at our prayer circle, which was really exciting. And she's doing PT. And if any of you have ever done physical therapy before, that's it is both a blessing and a curse at the same time. And she's definitely experiencing that. So prayers for her. And then Lori, did you have a prayer? I know that you lifted up a prayer last night. Did you want to share one?
I do. My niece, Jessie, she's 5 months pregnant, and she's constantly having issues with her pregnancy from bleeding. So she's in and out of the hospital all the time. She's only 30 weeks pregnant, and she needs to at least be 36 before there's not major complications. So prayers for her would be greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. We lifted her up last night, and we'll lift her up again.
Thank you.
And a couple other things too. Just one of our faith communities, First Church, United Methodist Church in Crystal Lake. Their senior pastor, Pastor Lisa Krause Safford, her husband died very suddenly and unexpectedly on Saturday morning, and so prayers surrounding the entire First Church community, that First United Methodist Church community, and especially that family as they continue to reel from that. Yeah, it's just awful. And then I'll end it with good news, which is Anthony, whom we've been praying for, stopped by for a visit. So that was exciting. He's home now and is still undergoing significant treatment. I don't know how his family is able to keep up with that. His mom was a nurse, so I know, thank God for that. But he's been doing, since he's been out of the hospital, when they went into the hospital, there were 4 inches of snow on the ground. He came out of the hospital last week and it was 90 degrees. So it's been a thing. But his favorite thing is for his mom to drive him around in a van to see people. So we got to see him, and it was just unbelievable. What a gift that was. Still needs lots of prayers. It still has chemo and just a long road ahead. But what a joy. I mean, what a joy it was to see him. Just unbelievable. So thanks. All right. Any other prayers that folks want to lift up? Okay, well, let's gather our hearts and minds. Let's pray. Are you guys hearing? Hold on, before we pray, are you guys hearing something?
Yes.
I feel like I'm getting feedback, but I don't know where it's from. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, we'll just see what we can do here. I'm going to mute everybody real quick and see if that fixes it. That seemed to fix it. Okay, let's pray. God of love and light, since the very beginning of creation, you call us into life, into trust, into grace. And God, so often we fall away from that. So often our hearts become hardened by pain, by worry, by anxiety, and we cannot hear your word of love and grace. We struggle to hear your word of compassion, and we struggle to love ourselves, to love our neighbors, to love the stranger, and to love you. And yet, even in those moments, you do not leave us. You remain with us, around us, and beside us. And so, God, as we gather to hear once again your holy word, remembering that you are present not only with us, but with all of your children, we lift up prayers for Bethany and for Linda. We lift up prayers for Mike's family, his sister and her family, as they continue to recover from COVID, and his mom as she prepares for back surgery and the hoped for relief that will bring, and his cousin Michelle. We lift up prayers for Jessica and the anxiety surrounding her and her pregnancy and the complications therein, that you would grant healing and wholeness to her. We ask you to be with so many who are in need of healing and wholeness and strength within our greater community as they are on our prayer list and in our hearts. God, be with us. Today, help us to hear in one another's voices and through your holy word a new message of hope, of grace and encouragement, to be your people, a people who are working for an abundant life for all of creation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Can you guys, I don't know, now it got super quiet because I muted everybody, so now it's funny on the other side. Dave, it's good to see you. Sorry, I muted you. I can unmute you now. There you go. It's good to see you.
I figured it out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Good to have you on here. All right. Well, today we're going to look at Exodus. If you hear weird, I don't know if you can hear my children. Hopefully you can't, but they've decided to be particularly loud this morning. So sorry if you can hear them. We're going to jump into Exodus chapter 7. So this is kind of an interesting passage about that's going to talk about the plagues. So this is we're going to dig into it a bit more, but this is probably one of the most visual parts of the Bible. Is we think of the plagues of Egypt and all of that, but we want to dig a little bit deeper into that, which is what's going on here and what does God do in the midst of great systemic evil and oppression, which is really what's happening here, which is kind of an interesting piece as we kind of think about where the world is turning and going in the midst of our own plague, actually, that's going on right now. So we're going to talk about that. Again, we're looking at, it's going to be Exodus chapter 7, and we're going to start with verse 8, and we're going to read verse 8 through verse 23. Would somebody be willing to read that for us?
I can do it.
That'd be great. Thanks.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Perform a miracle,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Wait on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the desert. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know, and I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water." The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will return to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars." Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt. But the Egyptian magicians did the same things by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went into his palace and did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the river.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to start with that. And in this passage, we're somewhat jumping in the middle of the story. You heard some of that last week about Moses's birth and Moses kind of coming up and being called by God and then being commanded to go back, obviously, to return here back to Pharaoh, to his brother Aaron first, and Aaron will act as Moses's prophet, as the voice piece. So there's kind of an odd thing that happens at the beginning of this chapter that we didn't read in verses 1, where it says that God says to Moses, "Look, I will make you like a god to Pharaoh." and Aaron shall be your prophet. So when Aaron is talked about being the prophet, it's actually, he's the prophet of Moses. He's the mouthpiece of Moses, not the mouthpiece of God. Moses is the mouthpiece of God, but they've created a different power dynamic there. And part of that is to put Moses on an evil playing field with Pharaoh, because remember, Pharaoh is considered a god. He is the god. And so all of the things that Pharaoh, that happened within Egypt happened because Pharaoh says so. And so this kind of raises Moses up at an equal level to Pharaoh by God saying that. So that's what happens. We have this kind of this back and forth. What stands out to you? What speaks to you in today's reading that we heard? What are you confused by, challenged by? What is God saying to you?
It sort of confused me that God already knew that Pharaoh was going to reject these proofs of godliness. He hardened his heart as he knew he would.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange sort of thing there, the hardening of the heart. So this is something that's perplexed a lot of folks for a long time, which is, was the hardening of Pharaoh's heart predetermined? Do you think that it was God who decided that Pharaoh's heart would be hardened, and did it, or did Pharaoh decide to harden Pharaoh's own heart, and God was aware of just the nature of who Pharaoh is and how power corrupts?
I did read ahead. So I tend to think that God may have been in charge of the whole thing. Sort of setting it up to make his godliness indisputable. If Pharaoh had capitulated and turned them loose, turned them free on first request, all of Egypt would not have been aware of God's power. But by the time that Pharaoh, with his hardened heart, brought more proof from God, hardly anyone in Egypt could really deny that there was a higher power there.
Yeah.
If you look earlier in 7:3, it says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart."
Yep. But does that mean that every time that God hardens Pharaoh's heart? It's a tricky
That's
thing.
how I took it to mean.
What's that?
That's how I took it to mean.
Okay. In which case, Pharaoh's not a bad guy. I mean, it's not up to Pharaoh, right? It's up to God. I mean, God's the one that brings all this about. Scott, you looked like you were going to say something earlier. I don't know if you're...
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I think it is a choice, I think, that Pharaoh made. But I was really confused. I don't know what it was. It's just like, all right, so these guys are around with a bunch of staffs. They're throwing them down. They're turning into snakes. And, it's like, I think, but so I was a little, confused by it until I think what was going on was sort of like a theological debate, maybe between the Egyptian faith and the faith of the Israelites. That these rods are, basically the words of their respective faiths. And so there was something going on there where eventually the faith of the Israelites was more powerful than the basis of the faith of the Egyptian. I don't know if I'm right on that, but I don't know how else to interpret, these rods that guide people through the desert and are very utilitarian, turning into these magical serpents. So I think that's, I don't know if I'm right there or not.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. So let's I think what's going on here are multiple things. One is undoubtedly a theological contest, right? So we have this piece of, and there is an argument that I think, a strong argument that can be made, that the first 15 chapters of Exodus are that's what it is. It's a theological contest. It's about who God is and who is God and who isn't God, right? So last week you heard a little bit about Pharaoh, but how does Exodus begin? You remember how it starts? We end Genesis with the family of Joseph, right? So Joseph and Jacob's family. Jacob becomes Israel. The 12 brothers, right, are reunited. They are prosperous in the land of Egypt, right? So everything seems to be going well, except for one huge problem. And what's the one big problem? They're doing well, they're prosperous, they're growing, they're multiplying, but where are they?
They're in Egypt.
In Egypt.
Yeah, they're in the wrong place, right? Yep. They're not where they're supposed to be. Everything else is going well. So that sets up Exodus. Exodus, we have now made this big transition from a family to a nation. As it says in Exodus 1, the Israelites are doing exactly what God wanted them to do, which is be fruitful, multiply, and fill the area, right? So this is going all the way back to Genesis 1. God says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And they don't do that, right? So at the beginning, there's division and things, and instead of being fruitful and multiply, they start killing each other. And then, of course, after the flood narrative, he says, be fruitful and multiply. They got that part right, but do they go and fill the earth? No, they all gather together and build the Tower of Babel, right? And so then you have that whole piece that happens. Now they've done it. They finally hit what God wanted. They are fruitful to multiply. They're filling the area. They're in the wrong land. And in the midst of this living into this time of incredible abundance, you have a new Pharaoh who comes over Egypt and is threatened by the abundant life of the Hebrew people, and so does everything he can to end it, right? To have control over that abundant life, to quash that abundant life. And he does that through first through extremely oppressive labor practices that actually has the opposite result. They continue to thrive. And then through trying to get others, the Hebrew midwives, to begin by killing babies when they're being born, and that doesn't work. So then he just ends up taking children and horrifically murdering them and throwing them in the Nile. So we have this piece of life and death, right? Power over life and death. And of course, the story of Moses at the beginning, you have one narrative that's overarching, Pharaoh as the showing that he has the power over life and death. And then you have this under narrative of Moses and God and what God's doing. And this under narrative of Moses and God and what God is doing is, while Pharaoh thinks that Pharaoh has the power over life and death, what is God doing? God is subverting that power by making life right, and not just creating a way for life to persist in the existence of Pharaoh, but doing it right under Pharaoh's nose in Pharaoh's own household, using all of the people that Pharaoh relies on to subvert that plan, starting with the Hebrew midwives, going through with Moses's mother, and then Moses's sister, and then Pharaoh's own daughter, right? So I mean, it's just like you have this kind of subversive movement that's just flowing underneath of what God is doing, bringing about, and all of this happens because of the Israelite people crying out in their anguish. And it says at the beginning of Exodus, God heard their anguish, right? That this is a God who hears the cries of enslaved people. Which, for us, if I was going to say and ask you, do you think that God hears the cry of oppressed and enslaved people? I would suspect most of you would say, of course God does. In the ancient Near East world, no, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. No. Why would God care about enslaved people? They're the losers. God only cares about winners. Oh my God, sorry. That whole language thing, that was a whole nother rabbit hole we could go down, but I'm not going to. But that was the vision of that time, right? Is that God's don't. So the fact that God hears the cries of an enslaved, oppressed people. But here's the thing that doesn't happen. God hears that cry. What doesn't God do in Exodus 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through? Does God fix it?
He
No.
doesn't fix it. He doesn't really comfort them or take them out immediately. He makes them wait longer.
Right.
He
What
doesn't.
is, go
he
ahead, Wendy.
doesn't- No, I was just gonna say he doesn't sweep in and save them. That's for sure.
How does God choose to liberate God's people? What are the tools God uses?
Moses
Yep.
and showing of God's strength to all.
He provides enough through the daily manna.
Yep. Yeah. Later we'll have the manna and the water in the wilderness. Absolutely. But he works with people. God doesn't just show up, right? This is, by the way, this is different from Genesis, right?
Mhm.
When the in Sodom and Gomorrah, when the people are being cruel and evil and inhospitable, which it has to be said, whenever you say Sodom and Gomorrah, that has nothing to do with homosexuality. It has to do with inhospitality and oppressive and being oppressive and evil and ungodly. That's what it has nothing to do with homosexuality. I feel like that disclaimer, we always have to say that because it's been used in such horrific ways. But when that happened, how does God enact God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah?
Firestorm.
Instant action on his part.
Boom! Right? That's it.
Done.
When God looks at the world in Genesis 6 and sees that nobody in the world is righteous but Noah, what happens?
Let's have a little rain.
There's a flood. We're going to take care of everything and do all that. But it's interesting that even then we start to see pieces of it, right? So God destroys everyone, but saves and doesn't choose to start over, but saves the remnant of Noah's family. Sodom and Gomorrah, God chooses to save and bring out Lot's family, right? And save Lot's family. There are pieces here where God is continuing to work with humanity and through humanity. This kind of crescendos up until now, where we've moved from this familial stage to this geopolitical nationwide phase. We have the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and God has chosen to enact liberation through Moses. Now, one of the things that I find incredibly frustrating in this is that Moses is grown up by now. If you were one of the Israelites that cried out to God in Exodus 1, decades have passed between then and now, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's very frustrating because I live in a world in which I expect that if I want something, I shouldn't have to wait 30 years to get it. Yeah. Like if I have to wait 3 days for my Amazon shipping to get here, someone's getting an angry email, I mean, like this is I'm just kidding. I don't care. But right. I mean, we are used to getting things immediately. And here we see that God heard, but from God hearing to this first plague happening, right? Decades of time have passed. Does that mean that God couldn't just swoop in and fix it?
No. He
But
just didn't want to.
Well, is it that God didn't want to, or it kind of reminds me of like, and again, just bear with me in my narrow context at the moment, but it reminds me of the fact of watching my kids getting themselves dressed in the morning. So when my 3-year-old gets himself dressed in the morning, I can wait 15 minutes for him to get himself dressed. And then most likely he's going to have to redo it 2 or 3 times because he's put most of his stuff in either inside out or backwards. Or I can get him dressed in a minute, easily. Which is better?
Patience for you and learning for him.
Right? I mean, so the whole thing, God creates us with infuriatingly enough, with the ability and freedom to love God and love one another, and the horrific ability to hate God and hurt one another, including ourselves. But what it means is that there are times when, does it mean that God is not working through us? No, God is working through Shifra and Pua. God is working through Moses' mother. God is working through his sister Miriam. God is working through Pharaoh's daughter. There are a million other ways in which God continues to be working under this, like God is at work in and through people, but it takes a lot longer to create that transformative piece, right? To get us to that piece. So we get to this piece, by the way, this comes all the way back to Scott. Scott's probably thinking like he's just ignored everything I said. Nope, it's, you know, my tangent. So we're coming around. So we get to this piece, and what we have is you have two people, two things, two entities that have called themselves God. One is Pharaoh. By the way, which Pharaoh is it? Right? When you read Genesis, every little king, Melchizedek, every king gets a name. Right?
Just Pharaoh.
This one, no name. Now, it's probably, people are like, it's probably Ramses II. The point is, Pharaoh doesn't need a name. Pharaoh is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the embodiment of people who believe that they have the power over life and death. Pharaoh is that embodiment of human, corrupt, oppressive power. So we don't need to give Pharaoh a historical name and locus. He doesn't need that. Pharaoh is Pharaoh. And so the historicity of it is not important. The symbolism of it is important. Pharaoh thinks that Pharaoh has the power over life and death. In addition to that, other things that Pharaoh had the power over. Pharaoh had the power over whether the Nile rose or fell. Right? The level of the Nile was up. So if the Nile flooded, it was because Pharaoh decreed it. If the Nile went down, it was because Pharaoh decreed it. Pharaoh made the sun rise and set. Pharaoh made the crops become prosperous or not. By the way, this has changed from the pharaohs of, remember the Pharaoh of Joseph, who that was not the case. But what has happened as Egypt has grown in power and solidified power, Pharaoh has determined that it is because of Pharaoh that all of this has happened. Not because of the people, definitely not because of God, but because of Pharaoh. Right? So what we have here is we're setting up that in one level in the plagues. So here's a bit of your trivia. How many plagues are there?
7, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So is it 10 or is it 7 or is it it's a weird thing. Let me say this. Here's the fun trivia of it. It's a trick question. Generally, we would say either 7 or 10, depending on there are 7 plagues that are dictated by God and 10 plagues that occur, but 3 of the plagues, Aaron and Moses just kind of do it on their own. It's kind of a weird sort of thing. But so anyway, long story short, if you're in a trivia night, that's a trick question. So no matter what, if you write 7 or 10, you can definitely throw down and challenge and still get your points on trivia night. But that's it, right? But listen, we're not going to read this whole narrative, but I want you to listen to what these plagues are, right? So the first one we read today, water to blood, right? The contamination of the water. Okay. Next one is going to is the plague of frogs, and the plague of lice, the plague of flies, the plague of dead livestock, the plague of boils on the Egyptians, the plague of thunder, hail, and fire, hail so large that it broke every tree in Egypt, the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, and then finally the death of the firstborn. So we have, if we break these plagues down, we have a plague of water. We have a plague of things that live in the water. We have a plague of creeping and crawling things over all the earth. We have a plague of livestock. We have a plague that afflicts the well-being of people. Then we have a plague that destroys all vegetation. 2 plagues, actually. Between the locust, the fire, and the hail, all vegetation is destroyed. And at the end, the lights go out. What does all that sound like?
Creation.
Yeah. Right? There, all of these things, if you think back to Genesis, are
The
aspects of
reverse of creation.
right. So which, by the way, let's take a quick side note. We're going to step out of this for a minute and take a quick side note. We're going to jump all the way ahead to a totally different story, the story of Job. Any of you ever read the story of Job? It's a fascinating, the reason I want to jump ahead to Job, because Job will ask, right, horrible, and bear with me, there is a connection here. All these terrible things happen to Job, right? Awful things. At the end of Job, Job comes before God and says, why did you do this? Where were you? Why did these terrible things happen to me? And do you remember, I don't know if you remember what God says. The whirlwind comes and God says, where were you when the stars were hung? Where were you when the sun rose in the sky for the first time? Where were you? God calls all the way back to the moments of creation. It's this interesting piece. And there's a piece in there. By the way, spoiler alert, the most unsatisfying answer ever to that question. But of course, that's the answer that most of us end up, right? We don't have that, but there is a piece in which God is, and there's an argument, that piece, somewhat, that's being made in Job, is also a piece that's being made here in Exodus, which is God and there is none other like God. Only God has the power over the waters and over the creeping and crawling things of the earth and all of that. There's another side to this. So there is this contest, going back to what Scott said, which is Pharaoh, you think you have the power, but repeatedly we're going to show you that God is the one with the power. Yeah.
Yeah. Another interesting thing too. God's one with the ultimate power, but one of the things that, and we noted this last week too, and in the Bible study, is that it doesn't seem there's no disputing that the Egyptian gods exist and they have power of their own. There are a couple times in the passage even today where it alludes to the secret knowledge. Yep. That the Egyptian priests possess, and there is some power, but it's almost like like little kids. My dad beat up your dad. This is a case where the Hebrew God is showing itself to be more powerful than the Egyptian gods. And I recall reading, Eric, I don't know if you've seen this before too, but where the plagues actually correspond to a very deliberate. I like your connection to creation, but it's also a very deliberate takedown of the Egyptian hierarchy of the Egyptian gods, all the way to the god of Egyptian death, that which would be the most revered god in the Egyptian hierarchy. Right. That Yahweh is just simply more powerful than any of the Egyptian gods. And then once the Egyptian gods have been swept aside by Yahweh, the doors open then for Moses to assert his leadership, human leadership, and take the people out. So God's fighting, but he's fighting almost like the celestial battle, as it were. I don't know. I don't know if you've seen it, but I thought that was a very interesting kind of observation, that there's not a disputing that the Egyptians had their own gods, but the argument was Yahweh is the
more powerful
on top. Yeah, exactly.
So two things. One, I would say, that's the traditional way when kings go to battle, and anytime there's human interaction in the ancient Near East, there's divine interaction. And so, like, if we go and fight a war against Algonquin, our Crystal Lake god fights the Algonquin god, and then whoever wins, we get to take. And we actually, when we win, what do? We actually sack their temples and take their gods back to our god as prisoners in our temple for our gods. The weird thing is this, though, and this is the one thing, because I have heard that, is that there's no discussion of other gods. Now, part of that might be, the other parts in the Old Testament, there's no problem in Yahweh throwing down with Baal, for example, right? That's going to be a huge part in the Old Testament. And here it's interesting. Robert Alter talks about this, where he says, the language in today's passage where it talks about let's see what verse. Sorry, my verse is just a
secret knowledge.
Yeah, verse here. Yeah, where it says their secret arts. And it's basically, it's funny. He says the phrases, the Hebrew word there alludes to the equivalent of smoke and mirrors. It literally, the Hebrew comes to these words of fire, and it's basically like they're magicians, and they are doing something similar, but not quite. Like Moses and God through Moses and Aaron are changing the fabric of reality. These guys are not. So it's interesting, like it was saying, for example, which I had never thought of. So, okay, they turn all the water in the land to blood, right? What is Pharaoh's response? Like, what do the magicians do?
They can do it also
How?
with their magic.
Where do they get the water?
That's a good question. I thought it was already all blood.
Right. So that's the thing. They have to dig a separate well in order to get the water, because all of the flowing, what was called the living water, the flowing water, is all turned to blood. And so they said, so you basically have to dig up blood, which then, like, it's basically the difference of, like, if I go to the Fox River and I make the Fox River turn to blood, and then you come and you pick up a glass of water and you're like, look, I'm going to change this to blood. Yeah, you did a glass of water. I just did the Fox River. Which do you think is harder? I mean, it's this interesting piece. This, again, it's part of that power dynamic. So I think, here's the interesting thing, Rob. I think it could be a both and. I mean, what are we talking about? A cosmic battle over the gods, right? Where Yahweh is dismantling the gods, which would fit that ancient Near East narrative perfectly. Absolutely. I think that's definitely a possibility. Is there also a piece where you have God saying, listen, like, Pharaoh, you think you're a god. I'm going to create Moses as a god, right? Which is what he says. And so we're going to set the two of you against each other, and I will show you, Moses, I will show you, Pharaoh, how little power you actually have. Which, I mean, I think is also interesting, because there's two things there. Under what Rob's saying, when you have the pantheons fighting, is basically you have a god. So what does that mean theologically? You have a god who hears slaves triumphing over the god who works at the beck and call of those of kings, which is sorry, go ahead, Scott.
I think that when Pharaoh hardened his heart, it is almost, I think he was suffering from Egyptian privilege, maybe not unlike our white privilege, that the enslaved and the oppressed people, he couldn't, because he was in the system of the Egyptian system, he couldn't just arbitrarily jump, say, oh yeah, you're right. It was difficult for him to do it, and his heart was hardened, so he couldn't be open to what was being demonstrated to him, possibly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, and there's a fascinating other, I think, layer here, which also says, so let's go down that road, Scott, because I think that's, why are the Hebrew people being oppressed in the first place?
Well, they were cheap labor.
Right. So their purpose is to maintain and increase the prosperity of the Egyptians.
Exactly.
So, but instead of actually building life, being life-giving, it's that oppression is life-destroying. And God is a God of life. This is one thing that we hear over and over again. This is the God of abundant life. Doesn't matter if we're talking Hebrew Bible or New Testament. God is a God of life. And so there's another interesting interpretation here, which says, okay, so we talk about the dismantling of creation and all of that, which is this God showing God's power and all of those things? Or is what's happening here is that God is revealing how creation damaging the oppression of the Egyptians is? Right? So basically you have these people who are solidifying power, that their oppression doesn't just have a negative effect on the Israelites. It has a negative effect on all of creation suffers. When you oppress one piece of creation, all of creation suffers. Because what you've done is you have thrown all of creation that was created in this beautiful Genesis 1 poetic harmony of one piece going into the other and everything fitting just right together. And what you have done is you have dismantled that, right? You have entered into it. You have broken creation. And when you break creation, what happens? Creation goes haywire. And so what we see here is this, I'm trying to remember who it was that said this. I think it was Fretheim who said, what you see is a hypernaturalism. All the aspects of creation going into crazy overdrive, right? So you have thunder and fire and storms and earthquakes and boils and plagues and things like that, which is interesting because let's just take a step back. And I want you to think about when else have we seen that where all of a sudden, like the effects of constantly using and abusing people and the planet for a small group's own prosperity has caused massive hypernaturalism and the dismantling of creation in, I don't know, hurricanes and floods and all sorts of extinction events and all sorts of other horrific things.
Yeah, so my question was when the water turned to blood, I mean, what immediately came to my mind was the red tides that happen in the Gulf.
Right.
So I don't know, am I right there, or was there more of a violent uprising going on? Were people dying? And I don't know. I just don't know the history of that period.
It's really great. So long story short, we don't know.
Okay.
So like there's the science piece. So let's take three pieces. There's science, geopolitical, theological, right? Science. Could there have been a massive bloom of red algae that would have tainted the water, killed the fish, done all of the things that it's saying, right? A massive red algae bloom would have sucked the oxygen out of the water. It would have killed the fish. The fish would have made everything reek and stink and all these things that are happening. Is there a scientific explanation? Yes, absolutely. Does that make it any less catastrophic and miraculous? No. Interestingly enough, how does God refer? We call them plagues. What does God call them?
Doesn't he just say perform a miracle?
Yeah. Yeah. Verse 8, right? Perform a miracle. Perform a wonder. So it's an interesting side note, right? That there is it's an interesting, God doesn't say call down devastation. God says, I want you to perform a wonder, which is an interesting thing. Okay, so that's one. Let's keep that in the back of our mind. One is the science. The other is the geopolitical, which is this part of a geopolitical uprising that was happening? And when he says, I'm going to turn the thing, that there was actually a physical uprising that was suppressed by the Egyptians, but, the waters ran red with blood, which, by the way, historically has happened. I mean, when there have been horrific battles and things where they talk about actually rivers being tainted with how people dying, it's awful, just horrific to imagine. But is that, and other people have said maybe what was happening here was actually a geopolitical uprising, or was it the not even an uprising, but the oppressive slaughter of Hebrews that actually had a negative effect on the Egyptians? Does that make sense? Right. So it's not even the Hebrews uprising, but it was the Egyptians oppressing and murdering the Hebrews and not realizing the way in which that actually had a negative effect on their own bodies, in their own livelihood. But at the end of it, in all things, when we look at the Bible, it's a question of what is either of those, what do they say about God and what does it say about us? And this, I think, going to when Rob and I, Rob brought up, is it the pantheon or is it just against God? Or for me, the issue is it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, but it always has to say, okay, so what does this tell us about God? And what does this tell us about, for us here? This isn't just something that happened long ago. What does it tell us about now? Right? So for me, I would look at that and say, okay, say it's a massive algae bloom that happened. Well, in this day and age, we know that we also have massive algae blooms that are destroying large swaths of not only natural, but also economic life and having all sorts of horrific things. And we know that those algae blooms are perpetuated by the rising carbon levels in the atmosphere and the way in which we create pollution and the way in which we've dismantled the earth and the way in which we have, in order to maintain our standard of living that we desire, oppressed parts of creation and usually people along with it, right? Does that make it any less horrifically miraculous? I think that the difference is that we look at it and we're like, well, look, it's science. It's just one of those things that happens. So all we have to do is figure out how to, like Pharaoh's magicians, well, instead of dealing with the root of the problem, which is oppression, we'll deal with the symptom of the problem, which is, well, how do we get the Nile flowing again? But we're going to keep the systems of oppression going. And this comes back to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which is you have arguably nine. The killing of the death of the firstborn is lifted up as separately. And I want to spend some time with that because for me, that's one of the most disturbing parts of the entire all scripture is the killing of the firstborn. We can get there in a minute. But in all of the others, we have this hardening of Pharaoh's heart. It takes all of this time. The whole point. What is the whole point of this? What does Moses want?
He wants his people to be let go.
Interestingly enough, does he want them to be let go of slavery?
Actually, no, so that they may worship. So they may worship me in the desert. So they may worship God in the desert.
He wants them to be liberated so that they can go and they can worship God fully and completely. Now, arguably, fully and completely is living the abundant life, which would include not being enslaved. That's a further conversation. But it's all of those things. Repeatedly, over and over, Pharaoh, why doesn't one Pharaoh do that? Because why would you want somebody to worship?
He wants to be God. He doesn't want them to be worshiping someone else.
Yeah. It's a theological and political rival. In all of these plagues that continue to happen, Pharaoh continues to be worried about the incident of the plague, right? So he goes to Moses after the frogs and he's like, fine, Moses, what do you want? Get the frogs out of my house. That might be a paraphrase, but right. So we have those pieces, but he's interested in the issues, not the overall piece. It's kind of it reminds me of the issue with the looting, right? People are like, oh my gosh, this looting is terrible. Like people are going and they're looting. And it's like, right. But it's not that the looting isn't a problem. It's not that the destruction of property isn't a problem, but the deeper issue of systemic racism in this country, you have to go to the root of the problem. And until that changes, this will never this will continue to fester up and boil because there is a rotten core at the middle of our society. And unless we address it, it won't do it. And the same thing here, there is this festering core that is erupting in these plagues, but Pharaoh's never addressing that centerpiece, right? There's never that piece, that core, that central piece that Pharaoh was willing to acknowledge and overcome. Here's the thing that's amazing to me. Why does God wait for 9 plagues? This doesn't have one answer, by the way. I think that there's a bunch. Lorraine had said one earlier, which I think is, one that's in scripture. So I think that's entirely possible. Which is, God says, I'm going to send 9 plagues so you can know how awesome I am. That's a paraphrase, but not much of one, actually. That's pretty darn close. Like, you're gonna see the power of God, and everyone will know. But here's the thing. So to show the Egyptians, did the Egyptians convert to following Yahweh?
No.
As a side note, so just to take a quick side note, let's step out of our theological hat into our historical hat. Egyptians kept meticulous records. Right. I mean, it's unbelievable. The record. I mean, we know all sorts of things from beer recipes to, how to store massive amounts of grain because they kept they were known for these meticulous records that they kept. Guess how much they recorded the massive enslavement of the Hebrew people? I mean,
oops, forgot.
Yeah, there's nothing in now. Lest you say, well, they just didn't care about slaves. No. They recorded the enslavement of all sorts of other people. But this entire story exists only within Hebrew scripture. There is no mention of this in any other historical account. Now, here's the fun thing. There are historical accounts of large red algae blooms. of the entire Mediterranean going black for a week. That actually did happen. So when the volcano over Santorini, the famous beautiful Santorini caldera that's there now, when that exploded, the entire Mediterranean, imagine the whole Mediterranean went black for a week. The ash covered the sun for a week, right? Which, interestingly enough, guess what happened to all the crops when that happened?
But they died.
Yeah. So it was, I mean, there also, so there are some things where people are like, this is kind of, there are some things, but it is an interesting piece. What I say is that people will say, well, see, it never happened. You're missing the point. The point is that this talks about who God is and where God is. Whether it happened on the grand scale that we're talking about or a small scale, this is about a theological scale, not a historical scale. Does that make sense? I don't want you to leave Bible study and then go and somebody be like, what? There's no record. He lied to me, which is what happens to a lot of people when they start seminary. And they're wait, what? There's no, there's no account of this?
I think, yeah, I mean, for me, Eric, I mean, just speaking for myself, I think that's one of the difficulties that the story of the Exodus raises, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, is why the gap? Why that gap in time between the cries of the oppressed and then the final freedom from bondage, and then subsequently why 40 years of wandering around the Sinai Peninsula until they actually get to the promised land. And it introduces, I'll use one of my $5 seminary terms. It introduces, in my mind, the whole problem around theodicy. Why is God allowing evil to persist? Why isn't God just stamping it out? And for me, the only way I've been able to reconcile it, Eric, and maybe there's a more elegant way, but for me, I had to juxtapose how the Egyptians were conceiving of their God and their activities as a sort of an insertion of human will and forcing action through the work of the magicians or their priests, versus the behavior of God, which is not a personified other. It's not some long bearded dude in the sky, but it is the basis of all creation. And so the natural cycle of cause and effect within true creation, within God's creation, does take time. Not to say that God as the basis of creation is indifferent, but there's no insertion of magical will. Things have to run their course for it to be evident. And that sets up, of course, a struggle, because we want to think of God as this personified other out there. And then so we wonder, well, why isn't God swooping down to take care of my little problems when I have my problems? And the answer being, that's not what God is, can be disorienting. I think if we think of God as something like the Egyptians are their gods, they're out there on their mountaintop throwing down lightning bolts and changing things according to willy-nilly, according to will. That's not the way this Hebrew God, the way our God behaves or the essence of our God. And I'm probably, I don't know if this is making any sense or resonating with people. Yeah. There's a fundamental difference in who this God is, and otherwise, in my mind, the whole problem of theodicy is the door's wide open to that. Why isn't God directly interceding and forcing things? If it really is this other, as a this fully anthropomorphized other, and so, like I said, that's a intellectual grappling and spiritual grappling for myself. I think this part of what this passage calls us to is just trying to understand who God is, and that's hard. That is a hard question, at least in my mind, Eric.
Well, that's why it's so helpful that God just answers Moses so clearly and directly. I mean, right? I mean, and I think that you're right. I mean, but I think one of the most dissatisfying pieces is, right, it's there's that old there's that old question of, where, why God, why, it's been, so many years, hundreds of years. Like I would say, like, we have to wait 30 years. Well, is that any different from the cry of saying, we've dealt with systemic racism in this country for 400 years since, the first slaves were brought over across the Atlantic. Why isn't this happened? And the question, right? And then like the old kind of story is, God comes back and says, that's a good question. Why? For 400 years, you've known this is wrong. Why are you still doing it? Why are you still hurting yourselves? And so it's an interesting piece that, we often hear that, right, history is written by the victors, right? And there's a piece of what are all the other, like we hear the story of Moses and going in there, but who else is God working through and in and doing things in the midst of bringing this story of liberation about and trying to do those different pieces. And I think one of the most frustrating aspects of God is that God chooses to work in and through and in partnership with people. I mean, even this whole thing here, plagues, like one of the most dramatic expressions of divine power, right? The plagues of Egypt. God only does it through Moses and Aaron. Right? God says, even Moses won't cut it. He's got to be like, okay, I've got to set up Moses, then I got to get Aaron and get all them, and then I got to work through them to get this stuff done, because God doesn't work unilaterally. And I think that that's extraordinarily frustrating for me, at least, because you're God, fix it. But I also think there's also a model of what power is, right? So you can look and say, hey, the Nile isn't risen, Pharaoh, fix it. It's your problem, right? It's Pharaoh's problem, because Pharaoh's in charge of everything. It's different if Pharaoh says, no, we're in this together, right? And so we have to care for each other, and we have to care for creation, and caring for creation will care for the Nile, and then the Nile will help us out. But we have to work in concert together. But of course, if Pharaoh does that, what does that do? It limits Pharaoh's power. And I think that comes down to, and with this, Rob, is the idea of, and I think you're right, if we think of all powerful deities sitting in the clouds, right, or above us or below us on their golden thrones, dictating the workings of the world, there's something that's very reassuring about that, which is, it's not my fault. It's because I made some God angry or made some God happy. That's why these things happen. It's far more disconcerting to say, no, that's not how power works at all, actually. Power works in community and connection with each other. And so God, out of God's love, works with us. And what that means is we aren't forced and bent and dominated by the will of God. But it also means that God doesn't come in and fix things when they go bad, which means that we have to allow God to work through us to bring about amazing moments of liberation, which may take 30 years or 400 years. I mean, as a side note, by the way, there's always that weird thing of like, what happens between, how much time passes between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus? Time.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I think Rob, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, that's what I think. But again, it comes back to me. For me, it comes back to Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. In all things, God works for good.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't mean that God causes or is in control of all things. And that's extremely dissatisfying.
Yeah, and I think also we don't want to go the other direction, which I've also seen this written in different places by different theologians, that God is quote unquote weak in the world. Surrenders, God's power because of love. I think that's also a simplification. So God doesn't choose to be arbitrarily all powerful, nor is God weak in the world. God simply is.
Yeah.
And of course that's it, captured in the divine name. When God declares the divine's name as I am, God is just simply the ultimate basis is the basis for all creation, and that's such an abstract, woolly thought, but it undercuts arguments of weakness or strength and makes those arguments, at least in my mind, irrelevant. They're asking the wrong question.
Right.
About God. If you're asking if he's strong, sorry about that. If you're asking if God is strong or weak, that's the wrong question.
Yeah.
Is God, what is the animating force of the universe, the animating force of all creation, the basis for all relationship and for everything? That's God. And that's a much bigger concept than, like you said, some, dude sitting on a golden throne.
Well, and I think, go ahead, Dwayne.
I was going to say, but this is also the story of God's relationship with his people. And, again, this isn't the day of instant cameras, us recording the events, on our cell phones. We hear these stories as they've been put together. I mean, there wasn't somebody scribe that was sitting there, getting the exact words of Moses and Pharaoh in their interactions. These are the stories as the Israelites have come out of Egypt, as they found themselves, as they become this new chosen people of God, they reflect on how did they get there? How did they come about? Where was God's presence in their lives? How did they explain that in the stories of these plagues? And like you said, we don't know what those time frames exactly are, but what they see is God's intervention occurring time and time and time again to bring them to the point in time where they are able to come out of Egypt, to become and recognize themselves as this chosen people. And so, this is where, what I want to say is, in the time of, even as I'm sorry for trying to summarize where a lot of the oppression has gone from slavery, but I think that a lot of people, when they dealt with this, the oppression was there. Yes, it was immediately daily that was occurring. But it was as they began to think about where was this going to take them? Where was God going to take them? As they start to look at the Emancipation Proclamation, as they began to move forward, and as they look at the song, they're looking to see where's God moving them to, out from that oppression, out from that slavery, and how do they reinforce that with stories, with songs, other things that are coming that they will be able to share with future generations. So again, not to take anything away from God's, but the Israelites here are trying to define how do they explain God's presence as they've dealt with this whole oppressive enslavement in Egypt, and now as they're going to come out, how do they share these stories going forward?
Meridol Marcuson wrote on Facebook, she's joining us on Facebook, and wrote, God is growing us in our faith. It's not as if we will only face one hardship in our life. And I think that that's another, I think that it's a both and, as Paul Tillich talks about God as the ground of all being, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being. But at the same time that God is also, while that seems vast and transcendent, separate, other than, which God is holy, but God is also incredibly intimate and within and connecting us one to the other, that connective tissue that binds us one to the other in community, as you said, Dwayne, calls us into community. And I love this idea because it's, the refrain that comes throughout the Hebrew Bible is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's true, right? I mean, God, and so it's this, no matter what you're going through now, remember, we have been through worse and I brought you out. And so use that resilience and that strength to grow. And we see that really often in the Psalms. But also it's an interesting thing of how did God bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I mean, it's not Star Trek, right? He didn't just beam them out of Egypt and just bloop, bloop, and put them in there, right? They had to get up and leave. And they didn't like it. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And it was scary, and it was terrifying, and it was awful at times. But what we hear often is in those 40 days in the wilderness, God was with them by day and by night, right? And it was 40 days of learning how to trust God and trust that, because you can't build a life in the promised land unless you can trust God. And so we have that kind of this beautiful kind of journey into that. And I think that that's the interesting piece, is that how do we I think Meridel, I like that Meridel says that, because there's also a piece in here which helps build our faith. And there's also an argument, which is, I always thought when I grew up that the Hebrew people were Hebrew the whole time and kind of worshiping God while they were enslaved. But arguably what happened is when they went to Egypt, they forgot all about God, right? I mean, what does Moses say when God starts talking to him? I don't know, who are you, right? And so it's also a reintroduction of, who is this God? Well, this is a God who works in us and through us and connecting us together, right? We talk about that divine spark that brings us together. And of course, frustratingly enough, too, we read in the prophets as well, Isaiah says this. So even later, right? This isn't the last word of Egypt. We'll be brought out of Egypt, but Egypt is always set up as like the bad guys, right? Pharaoh and Egypt and all this. And Isaiah is going to be the one later that says, hey, remember the Egyptians and the Assyrians who are bent on your destruction, they're also God's children. So yeah, you might be chosen, but Egypt and Assyria are also God's beloved children. And there's a place for them as well. And that the vision that God has for the world is the three of you united by a super highway of love. Long story short, people did not like Isaiah. That was not well received. But I think that I think is the other kind of challenging piece there, is even though in this story we have this liberation from, it's never a liberation over. Wendy, it looked like you were going to say something.
Everything that everyone has been talking about just keeps me pondering on verse 24. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water because they could not drink the water of the river. I keep pausing on that verse ever since Scott said, they're dealing with their own Egyptian privilege. But also, I'm curious if and I'm forgetting the term, I don't know why, but is there any Jewish writing around that verse in terms of what happens to the people left over after liberation? Because as you said, they are also God's people. I don't know if they were seen that way at the writing of this verse, but even the oppressor needs to remember their roots in creation. And the fact that the Egyptians are digging for water to live is somehow resonant to me. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I have never thought of that verse really. I mean, it's just there, but as you say it, it's really interesting to me because it's the Egyptians who are digging. Mm-hmm. They don't make the Hebrew slaves dig the wells. They have to dig the wells.
Right. So I just keep thinking like it shows that, Pharaoh is obviously oppressing the Israelites, but his hardened heart is hurting his own people. Huh. And we can't just sit back and go, well, look, these authorities are, fighting with each other, and we're just going to see who wins. Like, we still have to deal with the aftermath. And I just feel like that verse also gives some humanity and maybe even empathy to even people who were conspirators, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I could be reading way too much into it.
No, I think that's absolutely, there's a couple things exactly as you're saying that, right? I mean, the idea that there's still provision made for the Israelites. They don't just die of thirst, right? There's provision made there. There's also an underlying assumption that others, Alter and others have pointed out, that apparently the Hebrew people did have access to water because they're not digging wells. So somehow they weren't affected by this, right? That somehow, which is an odd thing that you don't like, well, aren't these plagues affecting the Hebrew people as well? I mean, that's not really touched on. It's just the effect that it's having on the Egyptian people. But it's also a piece of, it makes me think of liberation, like especially the disagreements that led up to the Civil War, and people saying, listen, the United States can't exist without, we have to have slaves. If we don't, then we'll suffer economic collapse. And there's also a piece in Egypt of being like, you know, well, the Egyptian society is built on the backs of slaves. What is the mass liberation of slaves? Well, you're going to have to learn to dig your own water pits. But here's the thing, you can do it. It'll be different. It'll be harder, but you will learn to do it and you will survive. Provision will be made for you. It's not the destruction of the Egyptian people.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I got to chew on that verse for a while. It's an interesting, yeah. So I want to ask, this is not in today's reading, but, and by the way, so real quick, I want to talk about the hardening of the hearts and the killing of the firstborn in the last 14 minutes. The hardening of the hearts is a weird thing. It's a difficult thing, and there's no real good answer for it, and everybody kind of dances around it and tries to find a middle ground. But in verse, I think it's verse 3, as Dave pointed out, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. In the 9 plagues that happen, or at least in the aftermath of 9 of the plagues that happen, God hardens Pharaoh's heart once. There's one time where it says God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and then immediately after that, Pharaoh goes back to hardening his own heart. Like he needs a little help from God to harden his heart once. By the way, there's 3 different Hebrew verbs that are used, and people have made a lot that says like, well, it's not really hardening. Well, some of them does mean hardening. Some means heavy, as if like Pharaoh's heart was heavy with sorrow. But Hebrew scholars say no, that they all mean to harden, to resist. Like, yes, different words were used, but don't read too much into that. But I do think there's an interesting piece in that, which is that for how we know who God is, the question is this as much, and what other scholars have said is this, it doesn't appear to be God saying, well, Pharaoh, that's it, you're going to do this, as much as by the time you get to the verse where it says that God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh has led down a path for which there is no other way, right? The consequences of Pharaoh's actions are set. There's no way, like the consequence of his actions will continue, which I was thinking about that because this morning I was listening to the coronavirus and all these things, right? And it was interesting hearing somebody say like this, like as the coronavirus is growing in the southern states and things, now states are taking measures to combat the coronavirus. But you won't know the effects of that for another 3 to 4 weeks. Because the people who got coronavirus yesterday will in 3 weeks, or the people who will end up in the hospital 3 weeks from now, no matter what you do, because they already got the virus and it's already happened. And so it's this interesting idea of the inertia of oppression. Not the inertia of judgment, of grace, but the inertia of oppression, right? The idea of, we can't just say, all right, let's fix this and everything is like, if today we said, okay, you know what? We were totally wrong. We're doing full reparations to all descendants of African Americans. We're going to do that to reconcile it. So we're going to do reparations and then we're done. Everything's fixed. No more racism, no more problems in the United States. Would that work? No, of course not. It'd be an absolute disaster, right? It wouldn't work it wouldn't work at all. I mean, because you're dealing with systemic oppression and racism over 400 years that has to be dug out at the root and unrooted and transformed and brought that. There is an inertia in the oppression of Pharaoh that cannot just be fixed overnight. I mean, and I think that's a difficult thing because as Christians, we believe in grace, and grace is definitely there, but we equate grace, forgiveness, with forgive and forget. And there is no forgive and forget. There is grace, but that healing after deep wounding takes a long time, right? That change takes a long time when we harm ourselves or harm others, and especially when we do it on a societal basis. So I wonder if there's a piece in that which is kind of interesting, which is it as much like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart? Is that just the consequence of the injustice of inertia? But I will say this: if you're wondering, like, who has the definitive answer on what the, like, this is a debate that has happened for hundreds of years and will continue for hundreds of years about what exactly is was it Pharaoh? Was it God? Where's God in this? And of course, then we have this difficult piece, which is on a symbolic piece, the death of the firstborn, the killing of the firstborn, has this beautiful symbolic piece, right? In that it is the symbolic flip, right, of what happens at the beginning of Exodus, right? What happens when Pharaoh, how does Pharaoh want to oppress them? He tries to kill the babies as they're being born. He tries to show the power of life over death. God shows that that's not, subverts that power. Then you have that kind of final capstone. And whether that's the power of life over death, as in the power of life over death over the Egyptian god of death, as Rob pointed out, which is entirely plausible. That's a big piece of it. That was one of, if not the most powerful god, was this power of death, this god of death. Or whether it's the power over Pharaoh, and through the power of Pharaoh believing that Pharaoh had the power of life over death, whichever that is, it's this idea of that there's a symbolic piece. But at the end of the day, you still have God killing a bunch of, by the way, as a side note, it says the firstborn, it's only the firstborn children. Because people are like, well, wasn't Pharaoh the firstborn? Like, shouldn't he have died? Yeah, it's not the adults. I mean, this is the killing of children. At the end of the day, you still have the killing of thousands of children. And that's a hard pill to swallow. I have no good answer for you. I mean, it comes back to Rob's question of theodicy and things like that, which is like, that's a horrific thing. And I've heard people say, well, if there was a plague that was through the land, it's not that God caused the Egyptians to die. It's that he created an opportunity for the Hebrews to live through the lamb and the Passover and all of that. And I like that, but that's not really what the scripture says. I mean, there's clearly the death of the firstborn there. And so I don't know if you have ever, if any of you have thought about that or struggled with that, or what you make of that.
No.
Well, I keep feeling like I'm projecting my own crap onto the Bible.
We all do
it. It's so difficult because, you know, you think of your own families or your own generations of hardened hearts and how difficult that is. And I'm going through a time right now with a family member where I'm like, you know, do I really just need a bully in my life when I've had one for 40 years, or do I let it go? And then you strike the balance with empathy for what made someone into a bully. And it's just hard. So that's what's going through my mind when you speak of, you know, what creates that hardened heart.
And kind of building on what you're saying, Wendy, there's a line of thinking that says that change requires suffering, and that then great change is going to lead to great suffering. And in some sense, that's how I've reconciled the hardening of the heart in a way, is that unless Pharaoh were a complete blockhead, which is how he behaves like a blockhead, you know, what Pharaoh might do when confronted with this dilemma initially would be to throw a bone, you know, do something palliative. Oh, we'll give you Saturdays off. You know, people are suffering. I'll give you Saturdays off. We'll make sure we put an extra water break every day. You know, whatever it is, something like that, which could at the moment to have people go, oh, Pharaoh's not so bad, right? And then the will to oppose, the will to fight against oppression, and also the willingness to endure the suffering that's necessary for change would be diminished by that. You know, I think about, you know, if we want to contemporize it, let's make sure police are getting sensitivity training. That'll fix it. That'll fix systemic racism. And it's like, not really. Is that a bone being thrown to the people to deceive in a way from a larger issue? And that's the kinds of questions that I think we can ask ourselves in contemporary settings, but also reflect back on the situation in the Exodus story. What does it take to keep a people motivated to change, to throw off oppression, and to endure what needs to be borne? Because the Israelites paid a price. There is no doubt they paid a price for leaving Egypt, but they had to be willing to bear that burden, to pay that price.
Well, and there's the other piece too, which is how generational is systemic sin. And I was thinking, Wendy, you talked about like families and things like that, and we hear especially in the Hebrew Bible, like the sins of the father visited upon the children and the children. And we say like, that's ridiculous. Like you shouldn't be forced to bear your parents' sins. But the reality is we do. Right? I mean, of course we do. Right. I mean, things that happened between that my grandfather did continue to trickle down, and whether we're talking about genetics and alcoholism and all sorts of other things that affect generationally, right, and family systems and all of those pieces. So I think that there's also I have heard interpretations say the death of the firstborn was bear with this word because it's a horrific word, the cleansing of a generation to allow a non-discriminatory generation within the Egyptians to arise. I still have a hard time swallowing that because for me, the whole point of scripture is it is an invitation to be transformed. If the only way we can be transformed is through violence and death, then how are we any better than Pharaoh? Right? I mean, it brings us right back to that. So it's a sticky wicket. I like what you said, Rob, about suffering, and great suffering brings great change, and we see that repeatedly. And but anyway, now that we have answered every question that you could have about the existence of evil and the nature of God, it's a good thing because we're close to the end of our time. So it's as I said, Bible study is far more about living with those deep questions than it is about finding those specific answers that we have. But thank you all for your conversations. For this conversation next week, we are going to take a huge jump, and we're going to go from Exodus all the way to Acts. I know, right? It's a little bit crazy. So we're going to be talking Acts 9 next week, Acts 9, 1 through 20, which is the conversion of Paul. And that may seem like a completely unrelated, ridiculous jump. But think of if we think of the conversion or attempted conversion of Pharaoh, and that's what the plagues are. And then we're going to see what happens with Paul as well and see how that goes. So look for some of those connections, those liberative connections that are happening there between Pharaoh and Paul and power, and what we do when we confront a different theological narrative and how we respond to it. But thank you all so much. It's great to see you all again. There will not be, just so everybody knows, I don't know if you noticed that in the announcement that went out, there's not communion tonight. We're going to start rolling communion into a monthly service on the weekends during our Sunday morning service. So we're not going to have the communion service, a live communion service on Wednesday nights anymore. We're going to start integrating that into our service. And mainly that's just because we were finding that people weren't really using that Wednesday night service as much, and others were missing it on Sunday. And so we're going to integrate that in. But do know, if you're looking for some of that communion liturgy, that all of those liturgies that we have been doing, those celebrations, are all still available to you. They're available on the website, on Facebook, and on YouTube. In fact, on YouTube, there's a whole playlist of just different communion liturgies, so you can always avail yourself. And if you're thinking, well, that's weird because it's not live, why are we doing that? One of the essential pieces in the communion liturgy is we say, when we sit down at the table, we unite with Christians at all times and all places, which means that when we come to the table, it is not about this exact moment, but rather this moment that links us through time and space. So I invite you to do that. And if you're like, you know what, no, we really need to do that, and you feel passionate about it, please send me an